So you guys are in for a treat. I told Rachel that when I was first asked to do this, I was a little concerned because really I was a non-fiction reader. And Jamie said, no, you're going to love this book. It's wonderful, and it's historical fiction, and we'll talk about that. It's fabulous, and you write so well. So tell us a little bit about you and your background, how you started to write. Have you always written, and kind of what the writing means to you?
So I have always written. For most writers who I know, and I know a lot of writers, when they became a writer, it was at least in part an act of defiance, or it had a little bit of defiance in it, and they would tell their families, and their families would be like, oh, why can't you do something where you can make a living? But my mother was a poet, and so I grew up in a literary world. My father is a scientist, so I'll just jump and say that my interest in science and in bringing literature and science together sort of comes out of my childhood. But being a writer seemed like a really normal thing to me to be. We knew lots of them. And I was writing stories and poetry from the time I was 11. I published stories in national magazines when I was in college. I went to the fancy Iowa Writers Workshop.
Tell us a little bit about what that is. It's not something I was familiar with.
The Iowa Writers Workshop was the first program in the country for teaching creative writing. And it was founded in the 1930s. And it, then there were a few more programs, and now there are a million what we call MFA, Master of Fine Arts programs everywhere. There's probably one right here in the Coachella Valley, I don't know. But it really said, you can bring people together and you can give them certain skills and teach them how to listen to each other and work to make their writing better. So it's a very fancy place out in the middle of nowhere.
And Bennington writing seminars.
Is where I used to teach.
Okay.
Yeah, I taught in the MFA program there for about 10 years. And I've taught writing at the undergraduate level at Swarthmore College. I live in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. Other places in Philly, worked with people. I've sort of taught at all the different levels. But in Iowa, I was really working on short stories. And as we were sort of encouraged to then, and I had a very hard time going from writing short stories to writing a novel, which is a very different beast. It's long, you have to keep the momentum going. And so since you've asked, so I wrote 3 novels that I could not get published when I was in my late 20s and early 30s. And each time, like in the old days especially, it took like you'd send things out on paper, and you'd wait to hear back, and in the meantime I'd be working on something else. And it was true that I hadn't figured out how to do it. I didn't really know what I was doing, and I didn't really have anyone to help me with that. And finally, when I was in my early 30s, I was married, I had 2 small children, I was teaching, it's a nice life. I was like, all right, I'm gonna try this one more time. And I decided that I would work with a kind of structure that was a structure I felt I could really rely on for narrative, and anyway, I thought I could maybe do it, and I wrote this manuscript, and I sent it to my agent, and my agent was like, oh, Rachel, I really wish you'd sent it to me at 50 pages. It's just not, no one's gonna wanna read this book. And I was like, okay, that's it, I'm done. I have this nice life here in Pennsylvania. I'll think of something else to do. And I and I called my mother and I told her that, and she was like, oh, Rachel, why don't you find another agent? And I was like, oh, Mom. Yeah, actually, I had, it was a different agent than I started with, and I've done that. I'm just done. Too much rejection. 13 years of too much rejection. I am done. And a couple of weeks later, she called me back up, and she was like, Rachel, my friend so-and-so says that her agent might really like your book. Why don't you just send it to him? And I'm like, okay, fine. Whatever. What's one more thing? So I sent it to this agent, and took him a couple weeks, and he called me up and he was like, yeah, I like this book. I have a few suggestions. None of them were big suggestions. I was like, yeah, those sound good. I'll make those changes. I sent it back to him. He sent the manuscript out on a Friday. over the weekend, he called me up and he was like, a couple people are really interested in this book. And on Monday, we sold it at a preempt of an auction for a huge amount of money. And, there are a couple of morals to this story. I'd like to say one of them is, always listen to your mother. And, but really, the publishing industry is strange. I'm sure many of your industries are the same way. And you just don't know. You just don't know because these people don't like it. Those people might love it. You just don't know. Maybe they won't, So,
Well, so I was going to say, we're here to talk about In the Field, but I'm glad she gave this introduction because her books are fabulous. Elena, This Side of Marriage, Lady of the Snakes, all of them are fabulous, including this book, and we'll read some from this. But buy the other ones. I think they have some of them. I don't think they have This Side of Marriage.
This Side of Marriage, that first one is out of print, but the rest are still in print, yeah.
So what got you interested in genetics?
So my father, I said, is a scientist. I'm also married to a scientist. I've known a lot of women scientists over the years. I'm interested in the question of women's lives. All of my books have to do with women and work and family in some way. Well, this one's less family. This one is more work, although there's interpersonal relationships for sure. And I felt like with the women scientists I knew, talking to them, their lives, their situations were sort of a very particular version of this question about women and work. And science was so hostile to women for such a long time, and it really took a very particular kind of personality and mind to be able to make it. And so I've been thinking about this actually since I was in my late 20s when my husband was in graduate school and I was meeting a lot of his classmates. And he's an astronomer, so it wasn't genetics, but I knew I couldn't write about astrophysics because I wasn't going to learn the physics, but I thought I could learn the biology. And I'd been collecting these stories and...
what do you mean collecting these stories?
So reading books about women in science, I have so many women in science have these great stories that I attempted to start telling, but I'm going to not go there now. But when this geneticist, Barbara McClintock, died in 1992, I read her obituary in the New York Times. I had never heard of her.
Can I ask, did you often read the
New York Times obituaries? Oh, yeah. How many of you read the obituaries? I mean, they're amazing, right? They're these great stories, a whole life condensed in this way. They're completely, and especially the women, and then especially the women who were not just there for their philanthropy or because they were married to someone famous. Really interesting to see. Barbara McClintock was never married and had no children. And that was pretty common for women of her age who made the New York Times obituary. They couldn't be married and have children. So this question of work and intimacy is also a really good, interesting question to me. What do you have to give up to be successful in the field then, now? What do you have, how does that work for different people? So I cut her obituary out of the Times. I put it in this folder of obituaries that I collect, because I have a folder of obituaries that I collect that spoke to me.
So I have to follow up on that.
Yeah.
Because does anyone have a folder of obituaries? Well, see, someone back there, you're not alone.
It's not that many people in this room, too. So let's say 1 in 100 people in America have a folder, I think, right?
But were you collecting them because you thought you might want to write a book about them?
Yeah, I was. Okay. Yeah, I thought, these are great stories, maybe I can use them. The other books I wrote are more completely made up. This one is sort of 80% the life of Barbara McClintock.
So what took you so long, from 1992 to?
I don't know. I just didn't feel like I was ready yet. It was hard. It was a lot of work. So I remember when I started, I asked my father, who's a geneticist, who's still living, Dad, do you think I can learn this science? And he was like, oh yeah, no problem. But then I started to do it, and I was like, no, it is a problem. but I said I would do it, so I guess I'm gonna do it. And then I would I would learn things, and then I would write about them, and then I would forget, and then I would go to revise, and I'd be like, oh no, I have to learn it again, and like make sure it's right, and then I'd have to learn it again. But at least because Barbara McClintock was born in 1902, and she did her most important work in the 40s and 50s, I only had to learn the genetics of the 1940s and 50s. I did get like a basic biology tech. So I got an old historical biology textbook from the 30s out of the Swarthmore College library where I live. The librarians were very excited to help me, and I read it, and they're these great, it's all black and white. The print is really small, and then these weird color plates of mice, dead mice, popsicle mice, a white one and a black one and a party-colored one, because they would have these plates to explain how genetics worked. So that was really cool. I put that detail in the book. But then I also got the current Bio 101 textbook, and I tried to read it, and I was like, I cannot read it.
So why did you include an author's note? I think you know, I've told you that for fiction, I kind of look at the first paragraph, and if it grabs me, I figure that's pretty good, and I'll continue a little beyond that. So why did you start with an author's note? That's the very first page.
That's the very first page. So this book is based on this amazing woman, Barbara McClintock, but I knew I wasn't going to be able to stick to all the facts of her life. I did not want to be constrained entirely. And so I felt like I had to change her name. So the character's name is Kate in the book. She was Ursula for a while. She was this and that, but she's Kate in the book. And because I wanted to sort of say formally, anyone who reads the book who knows Barbara McClintock would recognize her research and some of the quirks of her personality. I didn't want to hide that, but I also didn't want people to think all these things here are true. I did all the research, but I tried not to meet too many people who had known her. She died in 1992. There are a lot of people around when I was doing the research who did know her. I went to Cold Spring Harbor Labs in Long Island, where she worked for most of her career, partly because I just wanted to see it. I wanted to see this is the path she walked every day to the ocean. This is the building.
Did that give you inspiration?
Yeah, it was really amazing. I took pictures. I also did some drawing. And the people there were super nice, and they put me up, and they arranged all these interviews with me. So I couldn't really say, no, I don't want to talk to these people. But I didn't want to feel beholden to their version of her either. So I might have used one or two stories. One story from the grounds guy. I met a junior scientist when she was a senior scientist who had worked with her, and he was great, and he told me a lot of stuff, and he explained scientific things to me that I couldn't take notes fast enough. So I wanted to say you could stop talking now because I'm not getting it. But no, I listened. But the guy who took care of the ground. So she was a corn geneticist. That's why we have corn here on the cover.
Tell them what that means. Corn geneticist.
She, in the early days of genetics, before DNA had been discovered, before any of that, people grew corn and crossed corn plants with each other and looked at what the results were the next year, and that was cutting edge genetics research in the 20s and 30s. Later, fruit flies took that role, and then after that, bacteria and viruses. You can get a new generation every 20 minutes and see what happened with your crosses. But in corn, it takes you a year, maybe 2 years if you use the greenhouse. But mostly it's a year. So you have an idea of what you want to cross and what you might learn, and you plant the plant, and you take care of it, and you try to keep the raccoons away, and when it comes to fruition, you take the cob, and then you peel it off, and you take the corn kernels, and you can see if what you thought was what happened, and if it was, you might do this, and if it wasn't, then you might do that.
So tell us,
yeah.
The next thing in your book is a prologue. In your other books, I don't think you did a prologue, right?
No.
So why did you do a prologue in this book?
Yeah, there are lots of ways to tell a story. There's lots of places you could start. I'm interested in the way that the beginning of a book sets expectations. I felt like if you met this young woman in college in her freshman year, which is kind of where the book goes in chapter 1, I wasn't sure that you would get how amazing the things she was going to do were going to be. And so I did feel like for this story, it would be useful to say, here's this woman. Did you want me to read the beginning of the prologue or no?
I would
Yeah.
love for you to read. We're
I
going to
like
read
the
a
prologue.
number of passages because her writing is just so good. So, yes, I would love for you to read that.
Oh, you've marked it all up. So to where? All the way?
Well, at least to there, but you go where you
Okay,
feel
I might
like.
read the whole thing. It's only a page and a half.
Good. You're going to love it.
So
So
this-
this is the author's notes, the very first page, and then
Yes.
the prologue is the next 2 pages. And if I can just say this, what was so unique to me is in the prologue, it tells you the end of the story. It tells you where you're going to end up, and we're going to read the epilogue at the end
Okay.
because that's the end of the story. So it gives you this great roadmap. Tell them she won the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean, that's what she's famous for. So go ahead.
So, but I will say, so, I mean, in terms of the plot, it tells you where you're going.
Yeah.
But a book is more than just
Yeah.
its plot also. So emotionally, how does she go from being this person she was then? Who does she become emotionally? You don't really know that by reading the prologue. Maybe you have a sense of it. What are the, in terms of this question, I think the book is interested in, I was interested in about freedom versus intimacy. How much freedom did she need to do this work? What did she give up in terms of intimacy? How much intimacy was she able to keep in her life? Remember, this is a woman who never married or had children. So those questions, nothing gives that, the prologue doesn't really give that away. The epilogue makes, so anyway, so there's just a lot more than just the story. So, but you do learn she won the Nobel Prize, or you learn she won the prize, I think is what, we'll see what they say, what it says here, because like, keep changing all the words, right, until the very end. In summer at that hour, she would have been out in the cornfield already. Hot green smell of rising stalks, sharp blades of dew-damp leaves, wasps buzzing. But it was October now and dark. Kate had always been a light sleeper, an early riser, eager for what the day might bring. Often wakeful and restless, she wandered down to the lab in the heavy stillness of 3 a.m. She kept a cot there among the shelves of microscope slides and back issues of genetics in case she got sleepy and didn't want to bother coming back upstairs. After an hour's doze, she'd wake with her mind clear as though scrubbed, the work waiting. This morning, though, 5:20 by the stove clock, she was upstairs in the apartment kitchen when the phone rang. Drinking coffee in her old seersucker robe, her round steel glasses polished with a carefully pressed handkerchief, she was absorbed in an article about yeast. Some days lately, her mind felt sticky, a swollen door she had to tug open, but today it was working fine. When the phone rang, a loud, bright trill intruding on the humming silence, she glanced at it darkly. What kind of person called at the crack of dawn? 2 parallel answers, like 2 parallel streams of bubbles in an aquarium, bloomed in her gut and rose. But if someone had died, who could it be? Nearly everyone she'd ever loved was dead already. As for the other, well, it was October, and as many of you know, that's when the Nobel Prizes are announced. So I think all scientists at a certain level are wondering if the phone is going to ring.
So I love you said that because I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Makes it much more meaningful. Thanks.
She lifted the heavy, cold receiver to her ear. Hello, she barked. Is this Dr. Kathleen Croft? A male voice said. Melodic, affable, vaguely foreign. I have some very good news. The words clogged and confused her brain. They were like lights stuttering in the darkness and then going out. Then he told her what he'd called to tell her, her work, an award, recognition long overdue. Afterwards, she couldn't remember what he'd said exactly. The old, ghostly voices swirled around her as if trying to drown him out. Her mother's, It's a waste of money sending a girl to college. Dr. Krause's, young women don't take this work seriously. Hiram Cole's, science is not something to pass the time with until you get married. The committee had recognized her discovery nearly half a century earlier that genes could move from place to place on the chromosome, something that had come as quite a surprise. Well, that was true enough. But nowhere in the citation was the significance of her discovery mentioned, the true significance that she, leaping from sight to insight, had understood long ago, that genes did not absolutely determine what an organism would be. It was as though you celebrated Thomas Edison for making a filament of carbon incandescent without explaining what the thing did, light up a dark room. So now that I read it, I have many more thoughts about why we put it there.
So go right ahead.
Because oh yes, so many of the themes are set up. Okay, so this book came out a couple years ago, and I've been busy with the new book. So, right, so the things, what did the people say to her? These lines of dialogue we'll get to when we get to those places in the book. The various people from her mother to her thesis advisor in graduate school being like, yeah, no. She also, by the way, had many men who did support her. Like, this book is not like men treat women badly, but it's like many men, especially in science, treat women badly, and other men treat them well, and that's complicated and interesting too. And then this question of genes did not absolutely determine what an organism would be. So that's a lot of what her important work was about. It's not just the genes, it's also the environment. She was one of the first people to have that insight, okay? So that's like amazing, right? In the 1940s, and people are like, no, 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 no. Well, maybe in corn, but not in like people. But it's like, no, the environment plays a role. The environment, before the organism is born, the environment, like what the chemical composition of anyway, all those things matter. And for me, a lot of the question of the book is, how does this woman become who she becomes? To what extent was she born that way, with this quirky mind? To what extent did her father introducing her to nature at a certain time affect what she felt was important in the world? And then what her experience was when she got to college, when she got to graduate school and beyond. How did all those things make her the person who she becomes? So we're setting up the stuff there in the prologue.
So can you tell why I was grabbed right from the beginning? I hope I can find the one line that was just so good. It was about the door,
her mind
two
was like
parallel answers, like two parallel streams of bubbles in an aquarium. There was the other one about the door sticking together. I mean, that's how this book is written. It's so good. So do you consider this historical fiction?
So I'll tell the story I told earlier. Maybe some of you were there, but I thought this was a book about a woman in science. It doesn't take place that long ago, and we were told that the New York Times was going to review it in a roundup of a bunch of books, and I was like, oh, it must be the books, novels about science, roundup. And then the newspaper comes and I look and I'm like, no science roundup. Wait, there's this historical fiction roundup. I'm like, oh, look, that's where I am. I guess it's historical fiction. And certainly it is about a time and place that's different from our own, or a time that's different from our own. But it was not in the front of my mind when I was writing it.
So when I just read a book for leisure, I don't really ever read the acknowledgments, but when Jamie asked me to do a book, I read the acknowledgments. I want to make sure I'm prepared. And tell them what your father does for a living, and how that relates to this book.
Yeah, so my father is a geneticist. He's a molecular biologist. He does cancer research, and so I didn't go to him for a lot of help with the book, but it was nice to know he was there if I needed help. He read the draft for me pretty much right when it was ready for publication, just to see if there were any things, and his things were like, the beech tree doesn't have low enough branches for her to be able to climb up it. So he had a good, useful name. So, okay, so it's not a beech tree. Or maybe it was a different thing and we made it a beech tree, because I think a beech tree does have low branches. So, because she climbs a tree at some point to get into some building, she's forgotten her key, and she's not the kind of person who's going to go back home and get the key. So she's like a college professor, and she just climbs up the facade or something. Anyway, so, yeah.
So can I have you read what you said about your dad?
Oh, did I? Yeah, I'd love to.
It's the very last paragraph of the book.
Oh, that's gonna make me
It's
cry,
in the
probably.
acknowledgements.
Yeah. Most of all, thanks to my father, Ira Pastan, chief of the Laboratory of Molecular Biology at the National Institutes of Health, who told me I'd be able to learn enough genetics to write this story. My father helped me every time I ran up against something in the science I didn't understand, with the same patience and clarity with which, when I was a girl, he helped me memorize the valence electrons of the elements in the carpool, generally, and taught me the names of the common wildflowers in our woods. In writing this book, I was able to see the world through his eyes a bit more clearly. Yeah.
I didn't mean for you to cry, but thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So tell us about your writing process. Sometimes I think we think authors do the research, sit down, and just everything flows, and they write it in a week or so. But kind of tell us about how your writing process is. And especially in this book where, like you said, you're filling in the blanks in between.
Yeah, so I did, unlike with the other books I've written, which all required some research, I did do like 18 months of research for this book before I even started writing. I went to the American Philosophical Society, where McClintock's papers are stored, and I read through. She actually had, she was a serious amateur photographer, and she had like boxes and boxes of photographs and boxes of corn kernels, not of, and of also Queen Anne's lace. She was obsessed with later in her life, where there's a black dot on the Queen Anne. Anyway, so I wanted her letters, but it turns out that she had asked that all of her, or maybe at a certain point in her life in the late 70s, when she was quite old, she burned her earlier letters. And you ask yourself, certainly if you're a novelist, you ask yourself, so why would a person do that, right? What are they keeping private? So that's a question that the book explores and, invents. There are some interesting clues that in the photographs, in the papers, that in the silences. But there were a few letters from the early years, and those were really useful to me and interesting. I went, as I said, to Cold Spring Harbor Labs. There's a wonderful biography of McClintock written before she won the Nobel Prize by Evelyn Fox Keller, who's a historian of women in science and is herself a scientist. That book is really interesting. Then there was a more recent biography by this guy named Nathaniel Comfort, who disputes some of the earlier thinking about McClintock, and he now has molecular biology to help him understand to what extent the things she wrote really were true. And it turns out, well, yeah, they were true. Anyway, so I did that, and I took notes, and I went on these visits, and then I sat down and I wrote a draft. And in this draft, there's a woman scientist, but there's also another plot thread where there's a young woman living on a commune in western Massachusetts, and there's like witchcraft there, and like she leaves the commune and she doesn't know where to go, so she goes to stay with her aunt on Long Island. Her aunt is this famous scientist, but she doesn't really know anything about her. Like that, I gave that draft to my mom and my friend Susie, and they were both like, yeah, no, like this is, you gotta start again. This is just, which is terrible to hear. Like, but like, what are you gonna do? Like, if it's terrible. So I started again. It was a hard book for me to find the right structure for, and I think this is, interesting. I think part of the reason it was so hard was that the life was there, like, and had its own whatever, and it was hard for me to forget enough to be able to invent enough to find a structure that I felt was narratively sound. I'm pretty good at forgetting things. I do forget a lot of things, and I think that's super useful as a novelist, because then you can sort of, well, it was sort of like that, but like, how would it be really good on the page? And then you can go there. So it still took me many drafts after that. What is the book really about? I do this thing, and I teach writing also, as I said, and I make my students do this thing. So a novel is too long for me to write from here to there. I can't do it. Some people can do it. I can't do it. So I think that the story is like a river. It's a wide river, and there's a bridge over the river, and the bridge has these stanchions right down into the mud or whatever it is underneath. I guess it's the stone ultimately underneath there. And for me, I make a little drawing. I didn't do this for all the books, but for the last few. And I'm like, okay, here's where I start. Here's the beginning situation. Here's where we're ending. Here's what the big change is going to be at the end, or the growth, or the turn, or the whatever. And then here are the important turning points throughout the book. Like, these are the things, I think of them as like, after this happens, nothing is ever the same. Like, you can't go back. And then so I can write from the beginning to the first stanchion, and from there to the side. And sometimes they change, and I'm like, oh no, that one doesn't work. And I don't really know what's going to happen at the end or what the change will be, but I know there's a question, right? So the question in this one maybe is like, what is the balance between freedom and intimacy? What decision is she going to make? What's the scene that's going to dramatize for you and make you feel the change in her? I know it's about this, but I don't know quite what it is. But when I get there, I'll figure it out. Maybe once I get there and figure it out, then I have to go back and be like, oh, I have to go set that up. Better it's not set up. So let's go back to chapter 6 and to chapter 12 and set things up so that the line works.
So I'm always interested in the cover and the title of a book. So how did you come up with In the Field, and then with the picture of the corn?
The corn, which is also the landscape, because it's the ground, and then there's some clouds, and then the blue is the sky. I so love this cover. My vision, book about corn, kind of historical sepia photographs of cornfields from the 1930s. And the team at Delphinium were like, no, we're going to do something like eye-catching and alive. And they sent me this, and I was like, that is spectacular. I love that. The title was always the title. I'm actually not someone who's good at titles. I find them really, really hard. This title both refers to the fact that she's a woman in the field of science, and it also refers to her cornfield. These corn geneticists, they have these really big cornfields. They grow a lot of corn. The raccoons take some of the corn. Crows take a lot of the corn. I used to have a lot about crows in the book. My friend Susie was very excited. She gave me lots of details about crows, but I think most of it had to go. I had a scene where she was like with a gun, like waiting for the crows to come, which I think she did, in fact, Barbara McClintock. But Barbara, she was like, I am going to have a small field. I'm going to know every plant. I'm going to walk the field every day. She'd get up in the morning and she would walk the field. If it was raining, she would walk the field, and she knew every plant. And she would be like, that's weird. There's like 3 branches over here where like I would have expected. So she kept all that information in her head. Also like incredible notes, but she had this amazing capacity to absorb that. So in the field, like that was where she lived, almost literally.
So I want to get you to, if it's okay, to read. And I'm sorry that I mark up the books. But
no, I
that's
love
just kind
that.
of the way I
It's
do.
love. Those are marks of love.
So 148 from there down to there.
Okay, and the parts you cross out, should I not read those?
No, read everything.
Okay.
I was just.
Oh, those are
underlining.
underlinings. Okay.
Yeah.
Because my book, when I give readings, I do cross some stuff out because some things read better on the page, but then it's kind of long for anyway. It was a clear, where are we? Oh, yeah, okay. It was a clear, warm, moonless night, the great span of the Milky Way glittering. Paul, who's a postdoc classmate of hers, who's kind of based on someone real, actually, although he's more evil in this book than he was in life, so I kind of hope that family never reads this, never finds this book. Or I kind of hope they do, I don't know. Anyway, Paul cranked up the phonograph again, and again he and Kate danced, an inch of charged, buzzing air between them. Then he put the needle back to the beginning, and she danced with Thatch, who's the other member of the other guy in their close postdoc circle. She danced with Thatch and then with Paul again. This time he held her very close in the darkness. Her ear was against his chest, and his heart thumped so loudly she couldn't feel her own heartbeat at all. When the record ended, she said she was tired and went to sit down, but Thatch said, "You danced with Paul 3 times." "It's not a contest," she said, but she stood up again. "Life is a contest," Paul said, stretching out his long legs and throwing back his head to gaze up at the stars. "Don't be glib," Kate told him. "What do you think it is then?" he asked. "A web," she answered, "an infinitely large fabric in which everything is intertwined. And lucky people like us get to spend our lives poking and prodding at the seams, trying to understand how it all fits together." Paul laughed, a single loud hoot like a baboon. "That's a very romantic notion," he said. "It's not romantic in the least," she said. Thatch restarted the record and came over and took her hand, and they moved together in the dark. His hand was firm on her waist, and hers rested lightly on the damp back of his shirt. Paul sat smoking, the tip of his cigarette an orange glow. "What about you, John Thatcher?" Paul said. "What do you think life is?" "Shut up, Novak," Thatch said. "I'm busy." When the record ended, Kate said, "That really is all for me. It's been quite a week. Give me a cigarette, will you, Paul?" "A triumphant week," Thatch said, as Paul passed her a cigarette and leaned over to light it for her. Thatch found his teacup of whiskey in the grass and raised it. "Here's to you, Kate Croft, and to your diagram, and to many more exciting discoveries." Just want to see what happens on the next page.
Oh.
Okay. And to not having to work for that idiot Cole anymore. Yeah, she gets away from him.
So the question I have is, if this was a fiction book, I would know it just was something that was created in your inspiration, in your mind. But this is a conversation. This is a communication from 2 people expressing emotions. So was it based on something that happened, or was this part of the story? And how do you create that, in a sense?
Yeah, so these graduate school years, so Barbara McClintock went to Cornell as an undergrad. She stayed there for her graduate work. She stayed there for her kind of what we would call a postdoc these days. It was the Depression. There were no jobs, except for men. Like, her advisor found jobs for the men in the group, but not for her, because she didn't have a family. He told her, "You don't have a family. You don't need the." So I think I put that in the book too. But I was interested in this sort of, that was a moment where she was really becoming a scientist, and people were helping her and people were holding her back. She did some things she shouldn't have done, which McClintock, she could see through the microscope better than anybody else. And so people would come to her for help to see what their data was that they couldn't quite interpret. Or sometimes she would go into someone's lab and be like, "Hey, what do you have there on your microscope?" and look at it and be like, "Oh, I see blah." And they'd be like, "Hey, like, wait, get away from my microscope," right? So a lot of people didn't like her because she was like doing the thing that they wanted to be doing. So I was interested in how to dramatize that, and I invented this sort of triangle. There's this beautiful iconic picture of the lab that she was in, the guy who directed it, Emerson, and then the like 4 people in the field. So she's wearing, it's these 4 men and her, and she's wearing these like Jodhpuri pants that she got made for herself in like 1930, because like you didn't want to be wearing a dress in the field. And looking very jaunty and young and beautiful, and there's like a dog. And one of these guys, who I made into Paul, went on to win the Nobel Prize very early, much earlier than her. And she helped him with that work, but clearly there was a real rivalry there, like who was the best scientist in this group. The other one, who I made into Thatch, also a very eminent scientist, head of this and head of that. When they were asked late in her life, like for her 90th birthday, there's like a book of remembrances of her The guy who I made Thatch spoke really warmly of her and how great she was, and the guy I made into Paul was very parsimonious with his words about her. And you could sort of feel that one relationship was close and one relationship was difficult. But also Paul, in my book, sees her clearly. Thatch loves her and is in love with her, but Paul sees her. So that's interesting to me too, the dynamics of that. And in the book, and I believe in life, she's lesbian. So part of the book is also her discovery of, what does she want? Who does she want? Does she want anyone? Does she want no one? And Paul sees that. He's the first one who sees it. And so I just totally made all that stuff up, and I'm trying to give you a little sense of the material that I was working with, out of which I could say, and what would be a scene. They're having this sort of celebration because she has solved this incredibly difficult problem in like what the corn chromosome looks like. Like no one has done that before. And anyway, but really, and that's great and that's important, and the science is really important in this book, but the relationships and the tensions, that you can't separate them out. The science and the relationships are woven together.
So we only have a couple minutes left. Do you mind if you
read
some of the epilogue?
Yeah.
And you see how much time we have, and you tell me where you think you should start.
Oh my God.
To get it to the end. I kind of marked some different places, but you tell me. I'd rather you read more than less, but go ahead.
Yeah, I don't think we can read that much.
Yeah. So go ahead, read it.
All right. This is the epilogue. For the hastily organized press conference about the prize, Kate put on lipstick and a gold brooch Viv had given her once, back before she'd stopped trying to change what Kate wore. Would it kill you to wear a dress once in a while, she used to say, mostly teasingly, maybe on the full moon. Viv, who had been dead now 15 years. Mostly they'd been happy together, Kate and Viv, mostly happy, most of the time, for most of 2 decades. Even the last 6 months when Viv was dying, they'd been happier than Kate might have thought possible. If only Viv could be here now. If only her father could. When she called Laura, her sister, to tell her the news, Laura had said, all business, I guess we'll have to find you a gown. Her sister had surprised Kate more than once over the years. She had visited Viv in the hospital, bringing fancy chocolates and arranging great vases of irises and fringed tulips, demanding to speak to doctors. At Viv's funeral, she'd kept a fierce hold of Kate's hand as though they were still children crossing Flatbush Avenue, her rings biting into Kate's flesh, while Thatch sat on the other side, his hair grizzled, his wife Melanie and their teenage daughter sitting stiffly 1 row back in their dark dresses. Now Kate stood alone at the top of the steps of the laboratory building. High white clouds blocked out the sun. The photographers worried aloud about rain. How does it feel to have your work, which I understand was ignored for many years, finally vindicated at your age, someone said. It feels quite nice, Kate said. Laughter, as though she'd made a joke. Did you ever think you would win something like this? Oh no, I never thought about it. I always just enjoyed the work every day, which is what Barbara McClintock always said, though she was ambitious. Knowing chuckles, but it didn't bother her. She was too old to be bothered. What will you do with the money? The money. Remind me how much it is, she said, looking around, wondering what Paul had done with his. Paul, who had won the prize decades ago for the one gene, one enzyme work. More laughter, genial, festive, tinged with condescension, lapped at her gently like shallow waves. Nearly $200,000. Oh yes, my goodness, she said. Perhaps a vacation, the questioner suggested. You've earned one, wouldn't you say? Gracious no, Kate replied. At my age, I'd better keep right on working. I might not have all that much time left. More laughter. Partly she was playing the role they had cast her in, the eccentric old lady scientist, possibly gone slightly daft, but only partly. She was thinking that with so much money, she could have taken Viv around the world. Viv had always wanted to see the canals of Venice. She had always wanted to see the rainforests of Brazil. Not this year, Kate always said. How could she leave her plants for so long? Of course, Viv had had her own work. She had made a couple of interesting discoveries about antibiotic resistance, but she was not, had never been single-minded the way Kate was. She'd had her garden, had volunteered at the town library. She had played the viola in a good amateur string quartet. Sometimes, looking at Viv, Kate had wondered about the value of a life carved from a single piece of stone, a life you were always polishing, protecting. Had the variety of her days made Viv happier than Kate, less happy? Who could say? One gained what the other lost. But what was gained and by whom? And what was it exactly that had been lost? That morning, when the dignitary from Sweden had given her the news, her mind had briefly stuttered to a halt. She had disappeared into the past, becoming again the child standing over the jade green chrysalis, determined to know what was happening inside. All her life, she'd been asking the same questions. All her life. How lucky she was to have lived long enough to glimpse a few of the answers. Lucky, too, to have known the people she had known, Dr. Krause, Thatch, Whitaker, even Paul. To have answered the ad Thea had put in the newspaper, to have fallen ill and been taken to Sarah's hospital, to have agreed to give the talk Viv had happened to attend. Luck, contingency, persistence, endurance, or call it stubbornness. Call it anything you liked. Dr. Croft, the emissary, had repeated in his wavery musical voice over the phone, "Dr. Croft, are you still here? Have we dropped our connection?" "Yes," she'd said into the receiver that connected to a wire that stretched across the bottom of an ocean. Imagine that. Her voice rushing through the clear, cold depths where nameless fish lived out their lives in the dark. "I'm still here."
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.